Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're talking Tuna Melt. Which, to be clear, that's not actually the name for this watch. It's actually the Proxima PX1682 or Tuna V3. Tuna Melt is just what I nicknamed it, since it's obviously a tuna homage with a fiery red dial. It's cheesy, but I think it works here. And yes, I did use the H word for homage, but while the case here is a straight tuna, the dial is anything but. In fact, if you look really closely, you'll even see a pretty interesting day-date implementation, which is something that Proxima, as well as their sister brand, has become known for. They're both AliExpress brands, and they do have some straight one-for-one homages. Yet a lot of their watches will use a typical homage case, but do something completely different when it comes to the dials. Which is why I think Proxima is one of the more interesting AliExpress brands out there. Now, before we really get going with this one, there's one quick disclaimer. Some of you may have noticed the promotional tag at the beginning, and that's because Proxima did send me this watch, and as far as I know, they're not going to ask for it back. Now, with that said, let's turn up the heat and see what melts. With tunas, typically the specs don't tell the whole story, as the case shape is pretty unusual. It flares out from the case back, and then the shroud slowly tapers back until you get to the bezel. At its widest point, you're looking at a 48mm wide watch. Yet, the bezel itself is only 41, and the back that contacts your wrist is only 31. And with that, it's kind of hard to translate what that's going to feel like on your wrist. It's also a fairly thick watch at 14.2, which does include a slightly domed sapphire crystal. It's also fairly heavy at 134 grams on its waffle strap. So to sum all of that up, it's fat, it's wide, and it is a bit top heavy. Yet it's also fairly short when it comes to the lug-to-lug at only 45.3. Honestly, I think this is one of those watches that you never really know if you like or not until you actually get it on your wrist, which does make buying it online pretty hard. Even if you really like what you're seeing here, it's going to be a little bit of a gamble. For me, with my 7¼ inch wrist, it's not the most comfortable watch I've ever worn. Yet, it's also not bad either. When I first put it on, I did notice that extra width. Yet, there have been many days that I put it on and then completely forget I'm wearing it until I look at it. I've worn some larger watches in the past, and this G-Shock is a great example of that, where I put it on and I'm constantly thinking about it and just dying to take it off. Yet, this isn't one of those. And considering its size, it's surprisingly comfortable. Plus, you just get this massive presence with this watch. It is one that is definitely going to get noticed. The fiery red dial definitely takes things up a notch, but most of the presence I think is due to the case. Which does bring up a possibly obvious critique, that this is one for those that like big cases. But if you're someone that prefers a more streamlined design with much more emphasis on the dial, you probably want to look at something else. Not just at something other than the Proxima, but tunas in general, as the dials are always pretty small considering their larger size. Now, just in case you actually wind up getting this and wind up with buyer's remorse, luckily you can always loosen the 3 screws, remove the shroud, and give the watch a whole new look, which is very typical with a tuna. Although if you do that, just be aware that the finish underneath the shroud isn't as well done. In fact, I'd say it looks a bit unfinished, at least compared to the nice brush tool watch look you get when it's all together. One interesting aspect with this case is that other than the shroud, it's a single piece of steel, or it's a monoblock style case. If you look at the back, there's no case back, at least no standard case back. It's just a solid wall of polished steel with a stingray design. Now, the positives with this kind of case is that it's typically more solid and typically offers a more secure water resistance, just because there's one less potential point of failure. But for most of us watch geeks, I think there's a much bigger negative here, and that's that it's really hard to get access to the movement, to either service it or regulate it. In order to do so, you have to go in through the top. Now, speaking of water resistance, there is a screw down crown at the 345-ish position. And even with the shroud, it's pretty easy to access and use. It's also sporting a very blank looking mirror polish, as it is unsigned. As for the bezel action is great. It's 120 click, unidirectional, no backplay, and a fantastic clicky action. Heck, I'd say it's actually better than most Seikos I've run across. After all, it's actually lined up. I know I make that joke a lot, but until Seiko gets their act together, I think it's still worth repeating. The bezel also has a black Lume ceramic insert, which acts as a nice frame for the red dial, as well as complements the slightly domed sapphire crystal for increased scratch protection. Overall, the bezel is pretty great, and the only downside that I see is that because of the shroud, it is more difficult to turn, as there's only so much bezel to actually grab onto within these cutouts in the shroud, which, to be fair, is a typical Tuna problem. Let's move on to the dial, which is one area that Proxima always shines. And this 62 Mas homage, I think, is a perfect example of that, as I think it shows they're one of the more creative brands on AliExpress. Now, one thing that might get kind of confusing is that there are other tunas on Proxima's site as well as their AliExpress store, and it does include some older versions with a similar day date. But the specific one we're looking at here is listed as a V3, and at the moment it only comes in this dark red sunburst, which, if you like red dials, this is a beautiful looking red. The overall design is a little different, and to me it's not your typical tuna. With these beaver teeth at the 12 mixed in with dots and dashes, it almost reminds me of a Citizen Pro Master mixed with tuna hands. Although if you see something a little different, let me know down below. At the very outer edges, you have a slightly raised chapter ring with minute markings in white, which is then followed by applied indices. The rose gold framing here blends in just a little bit with the red dial, but the white lume easily comes through with clear contrast. After that, you have the ring containing the very unusual day implementation. For the date, you have a typical cutout for the date wheel down at the 6. But for the day, instead of that typical wider boxy cutout, the names themselves have been cut out into that ring. The watch still uses a standard NH36A movement, but instead of your standard day wheel, it is one that uses mostly black sections with one illuminated white square. So to actually read the day, you just look at whatever cutout is white and not black. It's very cool, very creative, but I gotta say it's also very hard to use. At least at first, and this one did frustrate me a bit, because in lower lit conditions, it's pretty hard to see what cutout is white. Even beyond that, the cutouts themselves are so small, it's really hard to read what it's saying. Although, in the long run, I did learn how to use this fairly effectively, so it is possible. There's just a pretty big learning curve. The thing you need to remember is that the day at the top is Sunday, and the day wheel underneath it rotates counterclockwise. So after that, you just kind of look for that glimmer of white, and then it's pretty easy to figure out what's what. My feelings are a little mixed on this whole thing, because in a lot of ways, I absolutely love the creativity behind it, as well as the design symmetry created by it. But at the same time, I have to admit that if you actually need to read the day frequently, this is going to be more of a hindrance compared to your traditional watches. Another interesting design choice is with the handset. The overall design is a typical tuna, but here they decide to use a stainless handset sitting on top of rose gold indices. Now, the contrast between the two finishes is pretty easy to make out, and therefore makes the watch easier to read. Yet, at the same time, it's kind of odd and does break up the design. All in all, it's a fairly interesting, albeit complicated, compact, and crowded dial. For some, there's just going to be way too much going on here, and I think they would prefer a cleaner design. Yet, I think there are many others out there who will fully embrace the complicated symmetry this dial creates, and just love to take it all in on a daily basis. If you're a fan of red dials, I think this is a pretty attractive watch, and everything seems to be exceptionally well made from these macro shots. Between the applied indices, hands, chaptering, and cutouts, there's also a nice amount of depth as well. For the most part, the Tuna Melt is fairly easy to read, which is kind of the whole point when you're talking about a tool watch. Although, if you're actually interested in buying a tuna, even an homage, I think you're also getting it for the design. Otherwise, there are a ton of other more toolier options out there. So my feeling is that if you want to go this route, you might as well get something interesting. And with the Tuna Melt, you're getting a well-made and creative implementation. And to that end, with the homage creativity scale that I've been using recently, I think I'd give this one a 5. As it's still highly identifiable as an homage, but with the interesting color choice, different dial design, and that unusual day-date implementation, it does stand out. Moving on to the Lume, and the short version is that it's excellent. And honestly, it's impressively so for the price. It's also fairly creative, as both the day and date are also loomed, which does look great, even if it is for a very short period of time. Other than that though, the bloom is excellent. This is one I actually talked about in a recent video, and I was so impressed with it, I had to compare it against the King of Lume in my collection. Now, in the end, it wasn't quite able to keep up with the Phoebus Great Wall, but it was able to keep up with it for quite a while, so I'm confident in saying this one will easily last you through the night. As for the movement, it's your standard Seiko NH36A, and for the price, it's exactly what you want here. Now, I haven't said this in a while, but always remember that accuracy with a movement is luck of the draw, and here I actually got pretty lucky. Which is fantastic, because remember with this particular case design, this isn't one that's easy to regulate. So just something to bear in mind, because you may not be as lucky with your movement. The watch Proxima sent me came on this tropical rubber strap, but if you are interested in a bracelet, that option is available. Although since they didn't send it to me, I can't tell you much about it. But I can say that this is one of the better rubber straps I've run across. It's comfortable and very flexible from the get-go. Lastly, let's talk value. You can currently find this one on Proxima's AliExpress store, as well as their own website. Currently, they're sitting around $200 to $215, depending on if you want the strap or bracelet version. Although that doesn't count any sales or current discount codes. And if I happen to know of any codes, I'll pin a comment down below. There are some cheaper Tuna homages floating around, but for 200 bucks, I think this is a good price. From what I've seen, Proxima seems to be on a higher build level than some of your cheaper brands. And here you are getting applied indices with a nice amount of depth, as well as fantastic lume and generally just an interesting take on a tuna. But bottom line is that this is a great tuna homage, assuming you like the red dial. And it's great not just because it's really well made with excellent lume for a good price, but because it's also not a straight homage. Proxima put their own unique twist to the dial, and I think that really helps it stand out from pretty much anything, let alone other tuna homages out there. So if you really like the red dial and you've been curious about a tuna, I think it's really hard to go wrong here. For about 200 bucks, you're getting pretty much everything you would want in an affordable tool watch. However, there's one thing I'd actually caution you on. Or actually, two things I'd caution you on. The first is just a general caution on Ollie watches, which is something I've talked about before. In my own experiences, most of the time everything's fine when you order something off AliExpress, but every once in a while there is an issue, and on the off chance it happens, it is much harder to resolve. So just something to think about whenever you order something. But the second thing, or the real thing I want to caution you on, is the tuna case itself. As watch cases go, this is one of the more unusual ones out there. Some will absolutely love it, while others not so much. So even if you're inclined to order one right now, I'd advise you to rewatch this video. Really focus in on the close-ups and the wrist shots, just so that you can be extra sure. Anyway, that's all I got for you today, but I will have another Proxima watch review coming soon. And this one is pretty interesting. In the meantime though, let me know what you think about this Proxima Tuna Melt down below, as well as what are your thoughts on tunas in general. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.